Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really plunging into one of the most complex and, frankly, heartbreaking global situations. The ongoing international diplomatic efforts around the Israeli-Hamas conflict.
It really is, and it's a landscape that seems to shift almost daily.
Exactly. So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that noise. We're going to unpack the recent joint statements from major global players, explore the often, contradictory positions, and help you understand why finding a lasting path to peace here remains such an immense challenge.
Right. We've sifted through official declarations, news reports, expert analyses, trying to pull out the key nuggets, the insights you really need.
So the goal is for you to walk away from this deep dive genuinely well-informed, understanding the core issues without getting sort of lost in it all.
Indeed. And what's truly fascinating, I think, about this particular moment is just the sheer weight of international attention. We should probably start with this really significant diplomatic event. A joint statement issued just today, July 21st, 2025.
Okay, a joint statement.
Yeah, and this isn't just a couple of countries. We're talking the foreign ministers of 28 international partners, plus the EU Commissioner for Equality, Preparedness, and Crisis Management. It's a very broad coalition.
28 partners plus the EU. Wow, okay, that's a lot of countries. So who are we talking about specifically, and what's the core message they're sending?
Well, the list is pretty extensive. It shows a real global reach. Australia, Austria, Belgium, Canada, Cyprus, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Iceland, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta.
Okay, quite the list.
The Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. And their message, it's incredibly direct, urgent, and simple. The war in Gaza must end now.
Must end now.
Yes, explicitly calling for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. Not much room for interpretation there. It's an unambiguous demand.
That is a very strong, unified stance, isn't it? But beyond just calling for the fighting to stop, what specific reasons are they highlighting? What's driving this urgency?
That's where the statement really gets its impact. They put immense weight on the humanitarian crisis. They describe civilian suffering reaching new depths.
New depths.
Yeah, and they condemn what they call the drip feeding of aid. They specifically highlight the inhumane killing of civilians, including children, seeking to meet their most basic needs of water and food.
God, that's stark language.
It really is. It shows the depth of their concern.
Are there specific figures or details in there about the aid situation that underscore this?
There's one truly horrifying statistic mentioned. Over 800 Palestinians reportedly killed while just seeking aid.
800?
Yeah. And the statement explicitly says Israel's current aid delivery model is dangerous, fuels instability, and deprives Gazans of human dignity. Again, very direct critique.
So it's not subtle.
Not at all. They demand Israel immediately lift restrictions on aid and comply fully with international humanitarian law. And, this echoes what we're hearing from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who said he's appalled by the accelerating breakdown of humanitarian conditions.
So the humanitarian angle isn't just a side issue, it's central to this joint call.
Absolutely. It's presented as a primary driver for this international condemnation.
Okay, so the human cost is paramount. What else does the statement prioritize, beyond stopping the fighting and getting aid in?
The other critical piece is, of course, the hostages. The statement unequivocally condemns Hamas for continuing to hold hostages since October 7th, 2023.
Right.
And it calls for their immediate and unconditional release. There's a shared belief articulated in the statement that a negotiated ceasefire offers the best hope of bringing them home and ending the agony of their families.
So they see those two things, the ceasefire and the hostage release, as directly linked.
Exactly. A ceasefire isn't just about ending violence. It's seen as the most viable path, maybe the only path, to getting those hostages back.
And it sounds like the statement looks beyond just the immediate Gaza conflict, too.
Yeah.
Addressing longer-term issues.
You're absolutely right. It strongly opposes any steps towards territorial or demographic change in the occupied Palestinian territories.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
Well, it gets specific. It mentions the E1 settlement plan, calling it a flagrant breach of international law that would critically undermine the two-state solution.
Right, the E1 plan. For listeners maybe not familiar, that's the proposal for building in a really sensitive area east of Jerusalem, isn't it?
Precisely. It would essentially cut off East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, making a viable contiguous Palestinian state almost impossible. That's why it's seen as such a fundamental threat.
Makes sense.
And the statement also points to accelerated settlement building and soaring settler violence across the West Bank, demanding it must stop. So there's a clear concern about actions that could prevent any future peace deal.
So the international community isn't just reacting to the immediate fighting. They're looking at the foundations for what comes next. How do these nations plan to actually support peace efforts? And are others echoing these calls?
Well, they reiterate their joint support for the mediation efforts already underway, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt, and they signal they're ready to take further action for peace.
Further action. That sounds potentially significant.
It does. It suggests a commitment beyond just issuing statements. And yes, these calls are definitely being echoed elsewhere. British Foreign Secretary David Lammy put it very powerfully. There is no military solution, adding that the next ceasefire must be the last ceasefire.
A desire to break the cycle.
Exactly. And even Pope Leo XIV has renewed calls for an immediate ceasefire and a peaceful resolution. So it feels like a growing chorus, a more unified international voice than perhaps we've seen before.
Okay, but as always in these situations, there's another side to the story. This brings us to the counter-narrative, the focus on blame, security, perhaps isolation. What was Israel's official response to this big joint statement?
It was swift and sharp. Oren Marmerstein, the spokesperson for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, basically called the statement disconnected from reality.
Disconnected from reality, okay.
Yeah, and accused it of sending the wrong message to Hamas. His core argument, and this is the key counterpoint, is that Hamas is the only party responsible for the lack of a deal for the release of hostages and a ceasefire.
So placing the blame squarely on Hamas.
Entirely. He argues Hamas started this war and is prolonging it by, in his words, stubbornly refusing concrete proposals. This perspective shifts the responsibility for the continuation of the conflict.
And how does that resonate in the U.S., given the close alliance and any similar reactions there?
Oh, definitely. U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, for instance, reportedly called the joint statement disgusting.
Disgusting. Wow.
Yes, and echoed that same sentiment that Hamas is to blame for the war dragging on because they keep rejecting proposals. This lines up with President Biden's earlier stance, remember, that hostages needed to be released before any ceasefire.
Right. The argument being a ceasefire would just let Hamas regroup and attack again.
Exactly. So you see this fundamental divergence. The international statement points fingers at Israeli actions and the humanitarian cost, while Israel and some key U.S. figures point squarely at Hamas's intransigence. It's a core part of the diplomatic impasse.
Which leads to the fundamental disagreement about the end goal, doesn't it? Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very clear about rejecting a Palestinian state.
He has been absolutely unequivocal. He stated, "I am the only one who will prevent a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank after the war." He believes it would endanger our existence.
So, an existential threat in his view.
That's the framing, and he's refused to bow down to international dictates on it, even talking about proposing legislation to formally oppose a Palestinian state.
That creates a massive gap with the international community, right? Most of whom see two states as the only viable long-term outcome.
A huge chasm, yes. It really highlights the deep ideological and security-based differences that are just incredibly hard to bridge.
And that kind of firm stance must make things incredibly difficult in places like the UN Security Council. How has that played out?
Well, it's essentially led to paralysis, gridlock. The Security Council just hasn't been able to pass resolutions demanding a ceasefire because of vetoes from permanent members.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Back in October 2023, the U.S. vetoed a Brazilian-drafted resolution because it didn't specifically mention Israel's right to self-defense. Then, in February 2024, the U.S. vetoed an Algerian resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
Okay, so U.S. vetoes blocking ceasefire calls.
But it cuts both ways, too. In March 2024, Russia and China vetoed a U.S.-drafted resolution. They argued it wasn't a straightforward call for a ceasefire.
So vetoes flying from multiple directions. It sounds like the system is almost designed to fail in situations like this.
It certainly exposes the limitations, doesn't it? The very bodies meant to maintain international peace and security can be hamstrung by the conflicting interests of their most powerful members.
What's the feeling about the UN's role in all this, given the gridlock?
It's quite concerning, actually. Some UN officials themselves have apparently expressed fears that the organization is becoming irrelevant, marginalized, and very politicized.
Not a good sign.
No. And it feeds into this broader perception that emerged around December 2023 that Israel and the United States were becoming increasingly isolated amid growing global calls for a ceasefire. So you have this international consensus building, but the key powers with leverage are often pulling in different directions.
Okay, so beyond the official statements, the counter statements, the UN paralysis, there are even deeper obstacles, aren't there? What did the G7 identify as a core challenge?
Yeah, the G7 acknowledged what they called the daunting divide between rhetoric and reality, a really interesting phrase.
What do they mean by that?
They were pointing to the seemingly irreconcilable motivations and visions of the parties involved. It's a crucial insight, I think. It suggests peace isn't just about finding the right diplomatic formula.
It's deeper than policy.
Much deeper. It's this gap between sort of the theory of conflict resolution and the messy reality on the ground.
And what are those realities? What's stopping compromise?
Well, the G7 observation highlights that fear, anger, ideology, and trauma often elevate maximalist positions, distrust, and a desire for revenge over compromise.
That makes sense. The emotional toll.
Exactly. You have Hamas refusing to recognize Israel's existence and Israel having these profound, deeply felt security concerns. It creates what the analysis calls a fundamental impasse. Both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, tend to view this crisis as existential.
And when something feels existential, compromise is incredibly difficult.
Almost impossible, yeah. It's not just about political disagreement, it's about perceived survival.
This raises questions about leadership, too. On the Palestinian side, you mentioned fragmentation earlier. How does that play out?
Well, you have the significant political split between Hamas, which controls Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority, or PA, which governs parts of the West Bank. This division really undermines a unified Palestinian stance.
Is there data on how Palestinians view the PA?
Yes, and it's pretty stark. One poll found 69% of Palestinians see the PA as a burden. And get this, 94% in the West Bank and 83% in Gaza apparently want President Mahmoud Abbas to resign.
Wow, those are overwhelming numbers.
They really are. It signals deep dissatisfaction and recent PA cabinet reshuffles. They've been seen by many as mostly cosmetic, not really tackling the core issues of legitimacy or governance needed for a unified peace effort.
And it's not just the Palestinian side facing internal issues, right? You touched on Netanyahu's coalition.
Absolutely. His government is seen as increasingly beholden to the demands and influence of the far-right members of his coalition, people like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir.
And they have real leverage.
They do. They've explicitly threatened to bring down the government if a ceasefire is pursued. That puts enormous political pressure on Netanyahu, limiting his room to maneuver in any negotiation. It's a critical internal obstacle.
Have we seen concrete actions from figures like Smotrich that reflect this influence and undermine peace efforts?
Yes, definitely. Finance Minister Smotrich, for example, has been withholding about $150 million in tax revenues that Israel collects on behalf of the PA.
Why?
He explicitly called it a punitive response to the PA pushing for international recognition of statehood. On top of that, he's publicly stated his intent to expand settlement activity in the West Bank.
Which directly contradicts international calls.
Directly. And it further undermines an already teetering PA. This is all happening alongside a noticeable drop in Israeli public support for a two-state solution, only about 29% of Jewish Israelis supporting it, even if it meant normalization with Saudi Arabia.
That's a significant shift. Post-October 7th, anxiety's playing out, presumably.
It seems very likely, yes. It reflects deep security concerns, making the domestic politics of peace even harder.
And the diplomatic fallout extends way beyond the region, too, doesn't it? You mentioned the Global South earlier.
Right. There are reports of wide divisions within the Global South because of perceived Western support for Israel. This is apparently leading to a growing negative perception of double standards and the self-centered West.
Is this just rhetoric, or are there tangible examples?
No, there are concrete actions. Malaysia banned Israeli-flagged ships. The Maldives banned Israeli nationals from entering. Nigeria reportedly canceled a visit from the Czech prime minister over related issues.
So real diplomatic consequences.
Yes. And beyond that, at least 11 countries have taken even stronger steps, recalling ambassadors, even cutting diplomatic ties with Israel, citing humanitarian concerns and alleged violations of international law. It really shows the depth of international frustration and how this conflict is reshaping global relationships.
Okay, so despite all these massive challenges, the deep divisions, the internal politics, one idea keeps coming back in international discussions: the two-state solution. Is that still the dominant view globally?
It really is. You hear it again and again. In halls of power around the world, there's near consensus on the need for a two-state solution. It's still broadly seen as the best security guarantee for Israel in the long run, and the most practical way to achieve wider regional stability.
So the vision persists, even if the path is blocked.
Exactly. While the immediate reality is incredibly complex and fraught, that long-term goal for most of the world remains surprisingly consistent.
And this consensus is actually leading to some action, right? You mentioned countries formally recognizing Palestine.
Yes, there's been a noticeable wave recently. In May and June 2024, Ireland, Norway, Spain, and Slovenia all formally recognized the state of Palestine.
That's quite a cluster.
It is. And others like Jamaica, Armenia, and Mexico have also moved towards recognition or called for it around that time frame too. It signals a shift, maybe impatience with the lack of progress on the ground.
What about major players like Canada or France?
Canada's position is interesting. They support a Palestinian state and say they're prepared to recognize it when it's most conducive to lasting peace, importantly, not necessarily as the last step. And French President Macron has said recognizing Palestine is not a taboo anymore.
So the door is opening wider, diplomatically speaking.
It feels like it. There's momentum building globally, putting more pressure on the existing situation.
And the Biden administration. They're also talking about a post-war plan involving Palestinian statehood.
They are. Vice President Kamala Harris laid out 5 key principles for what post-conflict Gaza should look like. Things like no forcible displacement, no reoccupation, no blockade, no reduction in territory.
Basically setting guardrails for the future.
Exactly. And crucially, no use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism. It's a framework aiming to prevent a return to the pre-war status quo and build towards something more stable.
But then you hit practical realities again, like the refugee issue. That's always been incredibly sensitive.
Hugely sensitive, with deep historical roots. Both Jordan and Egypt have been very firm in rejecting the idea of taking in refugees from Gaza.
Why is that?
They fear it could become a permanent expulsion, like historical displacements of Palestinians. It speaks to the deep distrust and fears in the region. Meanwhile, you have Scotland's First Minister offering sanctuary, but the regional dynamics are very complex.
It really highlights how every potential solution bumps up against history and security fears.
Every single one.
Okay, one last crucial area is accountability. There seems to be a growing push on the international legal front. What did that UN commission find recently?
Right. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry released a report in June 2024. It affirmed that both Hamas and Israel committed war crimes. That's significant in itself.
Both sides.
Both sides. But critically, it also found that Israel's actions constituted crimes against humanity, specifically citing extermination of Palestinians and gender persecution targeting Palestinian men and boys, alongside the war crimes finding against Hamas.
Crimes against humanity, that's a very serious designation.
Extremely serious. And the report notes that evidence has been submitted to the International Criminal Court, the ICC. So this signals a real international demand for legal accountability for actions on both sides based on international law.
So after digging through all of this, the diplomatic statements, the counter-arguments, the deep obstacles, the legal findings, what's the bottom line for someone trying to make sense of it all?
I think the bottom line is this. You have a growing, quite unified international voice calling urgently for a ceasefire and reaffirming the two-state solution as the long-term goal.
Right. The global consensus seems clear.
But that consensus is crashing against incredibly difficult realities on the ground. Deep distrust, internal political constraints in both Israel and among Palestinians, profound security fears. It's a stark example of global agreement facing entrenched local realities.
So this deep dive wasn't just about headlines, was it? It was about understanding those layers, the diplomacy, the disagreements, the very real human stakes.
Exactly, trying to see the whole picture.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe. In a world where global consensus like this faces such deep-rooted local opposition, what does it actually mean when the international community says it's prepared to take further action?
That's the big question, isn't it? And what lessons does this specific tragic conflict offer us about the limits of diplomatic pressure when those core beliefs, those security fears, those historical traumas seem, right now at least, so fundamentally irreconcilable? It's something we'll likely be grappling with for a long time.